Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Podcana episode 56. This week, we're joined by Magic the Gathering legend and Lille Lorcana Challenge winner, Frank Karsten, to talk about all things Lorcana and theory. Frank, for those who don't know of you yet, can you give us a little background on who you are, where you came from, and how you ultimately ended up here in Lorcana and being one of the first Lorcana Challenge champions?
My name is indeed Frank Karsten. I have mostly a background in Magic the Gathering. That's the game I've played for over half of my life, for quite a while at a high level, at the Pro Tours and World Championships. Did well enough to be inducted into the so-called Hall of Fame of that game. And since then, I've mainly moved on to just writing strategy articles, metagame articles about the game, as well as doing event coverage for large tournaments. I've also written quite a few articles on the math of Magic, given that I have a bit of an academic background in that topic. Probability theory, game theory, that's kind of my forte. And I have built up some of the useful deck building theory for Magic the Gathering based on math. And yeah, I've also really enjoyed applying that to Lorcana, which I picked up when it came out. It seemed like a fun game with simple rules but deep strategy, and yeah, it immediately appealed to me. I did not expect to win the very first challenge in Lille, but somehow I got there. So here I am.
Yeah, fun little tidbit for all of you listening. We were talking a little bit before we hopped on the podcast, and Frank was like, yeah, I actually wrote an article about probability theory when it comes to Lorcana and mulligans. I was like, yeah, I think that's been linked in about half of the Podcana videos. And most of you listening or watching here have probably seen that article. We used it as the foundation for a lot of our base theory in regards to set one and how we built those decks. Anyway, I want to touch on some headlines before we get into our spilled ink section, our listener question section. And ultimately, in the main topic, we're going to be going over a lot of theory, sort of foundational theory when it comes to deck building specifically and how it applies to Lorcana. But first off, Carl, I want to pass it to you to give us a little bit of the TLDR on the Lorecast that happened. I know a lot of people were expecting some news maybe in regards to a digital client. I think that was a bit ambitious, but what did they end up saying on that Lorecast?
So on the Lorecast, they revealed the official name for Set 5, which is going to be Shimmering Skies. The idea is you've kind of defeated Ursula within the Illumineer's Quest bundle. They did like the PvE package from the previous set, and everyone's kind of celebrating, but there's some type of mystery going on. That's kind of the lore element. So far, they have revealed quite a few cards to us already. Some look pretty interesting. I don't know if we probably won't have time to touch on it today, but we'll definitely be discussing it next week. There hasn't been a new mechanic revealed as of yet, but I'm excited to see if there will be. I think the biggest kind of new thing I've seen from the set is there was a new tag that was added, that being the Racer tag. So Wreck-It Ralph is heavily featured within this set, so maybe Racers will be utilized a little bit. And it seems that they all seem to be in Ruby, so maybe there could be some kind of combination of cards or synergies there. But besides that, we also had a bit of kind of a reflection on the Disney Lorcana challenges, the team really discussing how they're listening to community feedback and wanting to change stuff. I know from Atlanta compared to Chicago, they had very few people drop from the main event this time around Chicago, but that was because they gave more incentive to the players to keep playing, because if you made it further, you got more tickets, which you could then use to redeem prizes from the prize wall. So it is good that they are listening to us in that regard. Me personally, I was hoping to hear a little bit more about maybe the NA Championships or the EU Championships, Nationals, what these top 16 players are actually qualifying or are going to attend, but perhaps they were not ready to reveal that information to us as of yet. But that was essentially it. So exciting to see the next set. As I said, intrigued to hear about the mechanic, but still left wanting a little bit more, especially in regards to the Disney Lorcana challenge stuff. But it's definitely clear that they are listening to us for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And holding our breath for the digital client announcement as well. Anyway, in the other headlines, we had the Lorcana Challenge in Chicago. That was won by a pretty popular or famous player in Lorcana, but also a famous player from Hearthstone called the Rat. First showed up in some of the pack tournaments, I believe took some of them down as well, and did place well throughout the seasons. But the Rat actually won on Green Steel. Green Steel was the sort of expected best deck going into that tournament. He did not put nearly as many decks into the top 64 as you would have expected, sort of if you listen to the narrative on Twitter prior to the tournament. But it did ultimately take down the tournament. The deck looked reasonable. It didn't look, I think, post-mortem on Chicago, maybe not ban-worthy. We have a question about that in our spilled ink, but Green Steel did not dominate as much as I thought some people would think. And speaking to, I just want to give Moyne and I a little pat on the back. We did a tier list video on the Podcana channel, and pretty much in order, top to bottom, we got every single deck correct. All S tier decks made it into the top 64. They also made it in terms of the numbers they put in the top 64. It was sequential in the order we put them in. And then same thing for our A tier, B tier, and then all of our unplayable decks did not make it as well. I think we got a little bit lucky on that one. Not going to lie.
Yeah.
But we'll take them when we can get them. Frank, I want to ask you, so we have the Lorcana Challenge in Chicago being won by a previous Hearthstone pro. We have the Lorcana Challenge in Lille being won by yourself. And I don't know the player's background that won the challenge in Atlanta, but what does it sort of tell you about the game that you have these previous professional players and decorated players taking down these early tournaments? Like, how does it speak towards the sort of skill aspect of the game and also the various levers of the game? Do you think that Lorcana is a game of, like, how would you compare the variance of Lorcana? Like, what game would you compare it to? And you can go higher or lower. How would you compare it to something like Magic the Gathering and your ability to sort of, I don't know, secure a win at a 2,000 player? That's just ridiculous. I mean, these are 2,000 player tournaments. You would think that they're highly variable, but we're seeing players that you would expect to win end up taking down these tournaments.
Well, I gotta say I did not expect to win in that regard. Yeah, I definitely had some good luck along the way, but I think that Lorcana is quite similar to Magic the Gathering in the sense that there is quite a lot of deep strategy in it, with so many decisions going on, starting from mulliganing to then inking and sequencing and figuring out whether to challenge or to quest every turn. There is a lot of decision moments where players who are like generally well versed in card games, whether it is Magic or Hearthstone or other TCGs, the fundamentals of, I guess, understanding resource systems, a bit of intuition for how to line up proper plays, anticipating what the opponent is going to do and responding to that, like the concepts of playing to your outs, figuring out who is like the beat down, so to say, like who should be questing, who should be challenging. These are all concepts that in slightly changed form also appear in Magic the Gathering. So I think experienced Magic players can use their intuition that they have built up over the years to grasp Lorcana quite quickly and like do quite well at it. And that's not just Magic. Hearthstone is also quite similar. In some sense, Lorcana is kind of a mix between Hearthstone and Magic in terms of its rule set. So I know another good player from my hometown has a background in that game, and it all leads to like slightly different perspectives, but experienced card gaming players will surely be able to do well in Lorcana and make all of these small little decisions with like a lot of experience that carries over.
So I was planning to leave this towards the main topic, but I'm just going to get ahead of myself here. If you could point towards one aspect of Lorcana, like what do you think is the hardest aspect of this game? I mean, we can talk about, there's many different things, right? Metagaming, bringing the right deck. Is it the inking mechanic? Is it knowing when to quest and when not to quest? Like, is there one aspect of Lorcana do you think that players are maybe making the most mistakes in right now and that you could point to as the hardest aspect of the game?
That is a tough question. I'm not sure there is like one specific aspect, because all of the things you mention play a role. If I had to pinpoint one of them as most important, I guess figuring out which card to ink, because that generally forces you to think several turns ahead and really formulate a game plan. but all of these aspects you mentioned all contribute towards it.
I agree with you for what it's worth. I think the inking mechanic is an incredibly hard mechanic. I also think that inking, you make decisions on inking based off multiple variables or multiple axes of imperfect information, like what your opponent's playing, your opponent's general game plan, what cards are coming off the top of your deck, like what you have to play towards. I also think that making ink mistakes, actually the sort of misplays, they cascade into each other. So as you make one misplay when inking, it sort of cascades into the next, into the next, into the next. And I think on top of that, what makes it actually the hardest aspect of Lorcana is that there's almost no user feedback when you make that mistake. You just lose the game. There's no, you don't lose on board. You don't sort of take a low value trade or something like that. You just kind of subtly lose and lose and lose and lose. And you don't get feedback on where you're actually making those mistakes often when it comes to the inking mechanic.
Yeah, to really get better at that, you have to talk through your plays and your decisions with other experienced players. You could either like test games with open hand. You know, you'll need like a physical friend, but without Pixelborn, that's going to be the way we all have to play.
Mm-hmm.
Or play with someone next to you who then discusses like every turn. What should I ink here? Why? How do we imagine the game is going to progress? And actually, ideally, think about what kind of decision you want to make first, and then discuss without any bias. That's really the best way to learn from each other.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't talk through that decision process, as you say, you're not going to even notice that you're making a mistake. Like, how could you? And then, there's also no way to improve.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's like a fascinating aspect of Lorcana. I remember I saw you put up an article in regards to your win in Lille, and you mentioned that you played a lot of limited to actually prepare for that tournament. Like, how did you utilize that aspect of the game to prepare? And also, I just want to get your general thoughts on limited in Lorcana, because, you know, obviously there's a huge difference in regards to Magic the Gathering, where you're kind of limited, not technically limited on the colors you can play, but you are limited based off the resource system. Lorcana has opted to go with a draft system that allows you to draft any single card. Do you think that is a good system? Would you like to see it improved upon? Do you think that maybe creates, maybe it's a little bit shallow because players are just kind of searching for the same cards in the same decks when it comes to a draft? Or do you think there is currently depth in the draft gameplay of Lorcana?
I do think that limited in general can be improved, though that would largely be by kind of changing the composition of the commons in the packs.
Mm-hmm.
Currently, there are very few 5 or 6 drops at common, whereas there are a lot of basically unplayable actions and items at common. There are not a whole lot of teams to build around in draft. So often you're just trying to assemble a good ink curve and like a reasonable split between like playable characters and maybe a few actions. But the depth in draft or even sealed is far less than in Magic or other games where you have like more deck building restrictions with colors. As it stands, I don't really think they can change those rules, because if you were to say, well, you can only use 2 colors of ink, like in Constructed, but you have to build a 40 card deck, well, then suddenly you have to open like an enormous amount of boosters, which is also not very realistic. But I think I actually enjoy sealed deck a bit more than draft, because you don't really have the choices of which colors to pick in draft as you have in other games. Mm-hmm. Whereas with sealed deck, there's still quite a lot of decisions on like which cards to put into your deck, how to build like an optimal curve, and maybe figuring out like a general game plan. I have found it to be just a fun way of playing the game, because even though you're mostly playing with just vanilla characters without any text, it just brings the game back to its fundamentals of curving out figuring out the best challenges and quests every turn, thinking 2 turns ahead with combat. And I enjoyed that even more than Constructed, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I had played the most. I do hope that when we get to eventual, let's say, world championships or regional championships, that it will be a mix of constructed and limited, because I think both test different types of skills, and by having like a split format for those tournaments, you might be able to really find the best well-rounded player. And I felt there was even a bit more skill in limited than in constructed,
Mm-hmm.
and I enjoyed the games more.
I had a chance to draft at Atlanta, and I read your article sort of after I'd done that draft, and we definitely agreed on some card evaluations. I drafted, I had 4 of the Isabella Madrigals in my deck, which is crazy. I don't even know how far I ended up in the packs, the evasive, the quest for 4. But pretty much every card I was looking at, I was like, okay, is this card baseline playable? Is it an action or an item? No. Okay, maybe I'll pick it. Does this draw an additional card or cantrip itself? Yes or no? If yes, it's in my deck. And that was like pretty much all I did. And my deck was so much better than my opponents, because my opponents were drawing unplayable cards, and all of my cards were playable and or replace themselves. And it kind of felt like it really was at its base like just card game fundamentals. But it felt like if you had a serviceable curve, you just wanted as much card advantage, as much evasion as possible. Because in this format, I felt like the evasion was pretty important. With maybe it's because I'm biased because I had Madrigals, but
those are good.
Yeah, they are very good. They are very good. Very unfair, but it did feel like it was a callback to fundamentals. I would like to see a draft format where they add more restrictions, because paradoxically, I think that to an extent, not in infinite, the more restrictions you add, kind of the more decisions that the player's actually making. Because right now I felt like I wasn't making too many decisions when drafting, because there were cards that were overwhelmingly better than others. I also felt like that if other players had time to maybe practice draft a bit more or read your article, they probably would have been going for the same cards as me. Because I did encounter some opponents that were not prioritizing those kind of cards that were drawing additional cards or cards that had evasion. They maybe tried to build, maybe prioritize some songs, tried to build a theme-based deck, and it just didn't really play out. That was my experience in draft.
I think one of the interesting things I enjoy about Sealed, because I play Sealed for every set except set 1, and some of the board states can be pretty interesting, because you get to a stage sometimes in games where like you have a really, really big board, your opponent has a really, really big board, and depending on certain abilities of certain cards, like neither of you really want the quest, because then one person just hits into all of their stuff. They kind of have the huge swing. So it kind of comes back to, I remember Brendan, like we did this with like the starter decks. It was kind of the whole like Giga Quest, where I had like 7 characters. Yeah, you had 7 characters, and that is a really interesting like dynamic, because we don't really get that type of gameplay, that much board based combat in Lorcana at the moment. And I don't know if we will ever get that much, because constructed play is very, very different to Sealed, just with how many very good removal cards we have, right? Which is definitely not a bad thing, but it's a very, very different format. So I enjoyed that element of Sealed personally. But I do actually really agree with you, Frank, that the more I think about it, it's a very fun way to play the game, and it really brings it back. Like, I think it's a great event for people who maybe never played the game before, or that are new to playing the game. Maybe they've just done a few starter deck games. To hop in and just kind of build stuff. The no restrictions allows people to just kind of play with what they want. But I also do agree with Brendan that it does feel like a lot of the time I'm just picking the most highly quantitative card. Like, oh, this card is clearly just better statted and has a better ability than this card most of the time.
Yeah.
But
and card advantage is king in Lorcana, I think.
Yeah.
This is true. I would say that in general you just pick the best card. However, you still need to end up with a reasonable curve. So at some point, if you're lacking 3 drops, you will pick a worse 3 drop over a better 4 drop or whatever. There is some fine tuning in that for sure. But getting to these really big board states makes it very interesting. More so than in what you often encounter in constructed, whether it's a quest or challenge. I love that.
I think I might be the only one that's not in love with the idea of having the color restricted, because I think once, if it is there a restriction with the colors, I think it can limit your decisions even more once you have this. So there's an interesting decision in like what colors to build your deck for based on your picks. But then once you have decided, a lot of the picks are like, okay, I have 2 cards in the colors that I could play. I pick the better one, and then it's even less of a decision. Okay, which one is actually the best out of these, because
In
it's
sealed,
only a
for
few
sure,
to
right?
pick from.
Yeah, in sealed. In draft, you get the additional aspect of who is in these colors. Wheeling the pack around for your ninth pick or whatever, and then realizing when people are in and playing that aspect.
Right now, I don't think you could hate pick as much when you barely get enough playable cards.
Definitely not. Yeah, like Frank said, I think you have to completely revamp the system, even revamp the pack collation, which is we're nowhere close to that.
But yeah, I also had I only played 3 games of draft at the UK Games Expo, and I had a lot of fun, and I felt like there was a huge edge to be gained. And there was some really, really complicated board states where I needed to raise my opponent, but they have the flotsam on board that goes back to hand when they banish. So still I needed to race through that and give them like the least efficient trades possible for that. We both have 5-6 characters on the board, half of them evasive. My opponent has a character with support on the board, and then like that in just these 3 rounds, I encountered more complicated board states than I've ever seen in like thousands of games of Constructed.
I got blown out because one of my opponent's cards said like, it had like its first text, and then the second text was like, if you have this named character out, you also get this ability. And I was just like, I just never encountered this, and it was just such a ridiculous like niche scenario. But I absolutely got owned by it in like the exchange. Draft is fascinating. So in regards to dual format, it's a really interesting topic because when I look at Magic the Gathering, I think it works really well. I love Magic's limited format. I think it has a lot of depth, kind of depending on the format, but I think there's a lot of depth there. But I come from Flesh and Blood. And Flesh and Blood, we do have dual format Pro Tours and World Championships, and it's a very contentious subject because Flesh and Blood has had some, in my opinion, and in other people's opinions, some very atrocious draft formats. We had, maybe some design issues on the side of pack size and sort of ability to playable cards, right? So Flesh and Blood was a game where people would play over the maximum playable cards or minimum playable cards at a point, and they would attrition their opponent outs to like mill them out and things like that. It has since been fixed, so we're going into the Pro Tour next month in Amsterdam. It's going to be the first Pro Tour where you're capped on a 30-card deck, and you actually get more cards in the previous set. But we did go through multiple Pro Tours and World Championships where you would have high-level players, players that are going to win the World Championship or win the Pro Tour, that would sit down and draft. There's 3 classes. They would just force from pick one, and that was like a somewhat optimal strategy. So I'm very hesitant on dual format because I have PTSD from Flesh and Blood at this point. But yeah, we'll see. I'm excited. I honestly just want to hear them announce whatever these nationals are, whatever everybody's trying to qualify for. Frank, before we hop in this building, I want to get your thoughts. What are your thoughts on the top 16 to qualify for these events? Would you prefer a additional way to qualify that's maybe a bit more consistent and grindy, maybe accrue some level of points through finishes, or do you think top 16 to qualify is a good system for the first big tournaments here?
It's a bit tough to say without knowing anything about these
we don't know what
regional
the
championships
championship
yet.
is.
It might be nice to have some kind of point system, because if, say, a player would make the top 32 of a challenge 3 times in a row, they have clearly demonstrated their prowess at the game, but would not have a qualification under the current system. On the other hand, this is the very first year of like an official tournament circuit. So keeping the rules as simple, as clean as possible also has some merit. I would say it's fine as a start for this year. And then, depending on how the tournaments are going to be structured, maybe some kind of running points total system could be a nice addition as well.
Yeah.
But a consideration for later.
Do you have a preferred system as someone who played Magic the Gathering from its basically its inception? Do you prefer like an ELO based system, a top X to qualify system, or I think that Magic at one point had like the level of pro or something like that? Like, was there a system that you preferred the most for qualifying for the highest levels of invite only tournaments?
Oof, we've gone through a lot of systems over the years. I think ELO based systems ultimately came with like substantial downsides that players started to sit on their rating and did not really want to play tournaments anymore, which is an incentive you don't really want to give to your player base. For the most part, I think in Magic we have had systems where basically you get a number of points based on, well, effectively your number of wins or final standing at premier events, and those totals accrue over time. I think that is a good and reasonable way to do it.
Mm-hmm. And that was your favorite, your personal favorite for qualifying?
I would say so, because then if you also know that you have to get, say, a certain number of points to qualify for something, you also have like a clear goal and know like how and where to achieve it. Whereas if they have a system where it's like based on ELO rating, and they say, well, the top, I don't know, 20 players qualify for some kind of big championship, then yeah, you also get into these scrambles where you don't know if you should sit on the rating or like you're not really in control anymore because other players might pass you by, which is not a great feeling.
Yep. Flesh and Blood has that system, and it has encouraged players to sit on rating. Also, the way ELO works, for people that don't know, I mean, it's like chess, but then also there's a K value associated with certain levels of tournaments. So the K value is sort of your range in which you can go plus or minus based off your opponent's ELO and the differential between them. So lower level tournaments will have a smaller K value, something like 6. So you could go -6 at the worst, +6 at the best. And then something like the Pro Tour might be a K value of like 64. And then you accrue and potentially lose points that way. Moyne, were you saying something?
Yeah, it's also been my favorite system we've ever had when I played competitive Hearthstone, where we had the possibility to gain points for your ladder finish in the month, for some Open Cup every month, and then also for every major tournament depending on your finish, and then the top X in the amount of points would qualify. Which still, if you don't have enough points, maybe you're on the bubble, you don't know if it's enough, but you never had a disincentive to play. Playing more was always better. So I think that's an important part to a point-based system.
For sure. All right. Well, with that, let's head into our Spilled Ink section. This is our listener question section. If you want to get your question read out on next week's podcast, you can shoot us a comment on YouTube. We'll get it queued up. Over to you, Kawa.
So our first comment is from Hamburglar. I brought Ruby Sapphire to Chicago, finished with 32 points. Definitely didn't make day 2, but didn't feel like I was too far off. It was my first time playing the 2-game format. A lot of splits before they gave 20 tickets to players with over 30 points, so I was able to pick up my promo on Sunday. Overall, it was a fantastic experience. Everyone was incredibly friendly, and I really can't stress how great I think the player community is. I don't think I would have done nearly as well if it weren't for watching your podcast and having access to Moyne's live streams. So thank you for all you do, and keep up the good work, guys. Really appreciate the comment. Thank you so much. Glad you performed as well as you did in Chicago, and it's also awesome, as I mentioned before, to see that like I said, Lorcana are listening, Ravensburg are listening, and they gave you those extra tickets for getting to a certain stage, right? So it's not like, oh, I'm at this stage where I'm just gonna drop, I know I'm not gonna make it. Like, you can still get a few more decent prizes by continuing to play on. So that's amazing to see.
For sure.
I saw some stats on that where I'm not sure on the exact number, but I think it was over 80% the player retention of players that actually finished playing all of their rounds.
It was very impressive, I saw, yeah.
Yeah, like incredible improvement.
I would like to see, if they are listening to this specifically, I would like to see another competitive tournament run on the Sunday for people that maybe don't make day 2. If they want people to play throughout the event, that's totally fine. They can accrue points and get promos that way. But I think ultimately people come to these tournaments to play games, and what is standard in other games, I know Flesh and Blood does it, I'm pretty sure Magic does as well, is you have the competitive tournament on day 1, and then you have a competitive but less competitive tournament on day 2 for the people that don't make it. And it just gives players like the ability to play as much Lorcana as possible, which they tend to really like. The reason why I picked out this question, by the way, was I wanted to get your thoughts on 2-game format specifically, Frank. Obviously, it worked out very well for you, but how do you think it differentiates from 3-game format? Like, do you think that there's any validity in terms of deck pick versus in format versus format? And do you overall, if you can give as an unbiased opinion on 2-game versus 3-game, I know you've only played one tournament with it. Like, how do you like it? And do you think that it's a good solution and system for the future?
So as for the system itself, I'm fine with it. I can understand how it basically alleviates the impact of the die roll in Lorcana, and I think players also spend more time actually playing games rather than waiting for like other players to finish their third game if you had a quick match. So I'm open to the 2-game round system for Lorcana. I don't really feel strongly between 2-game or 3-game systems. I do think, however, that the current system with the bonus point for going 2-0 in a match does have a slight impact on deck selection. It does mathematically favor decks with either polarizing matchups or a small play draw disparity, and that can influence the metagame in a little bit, though I think most players don't really take it into account, and it's also not the largest effect. It does also add some undesirable incentives for collusion between unscrupulous players. So I think the superior implementation of a 2-game system would be to just not give a bonus point. In fact, that is how tournament Magic originally started back in, I believe, 1994 or 1995. Just a 2-game system where you get points for every game win. It quickly changed to best of 3, but there is some historical precedent there, and there was no bonus point back then.
Let's go one layer deeper. Does the 2-game format affect the uninkable versus inkable count in your deck in any reasonable way?
Not in any reasonable way. This is actually the first time I have thought about that specific topic. I can maybe imagine very weird situations where, because of like matchup disparity, you want to make like small changes, but that is like on a high theoretical level, and practically it doesn't really make a difference.
Yeah, I think the prevailing theory right now for those who put the tinfoil hat on is that you might lower your uninkable count to decrease the variability, because you don't want these potentially polarizing situations where you run into a matchup that should be somewhat smooth, and then due to your deck construction, it has now become polarizing because you go uninkable, non-inkable, non-inkable. It's part of the reason. So I'm with you. I think that the effect on deck selection is pretty insignificant when it comes to 2-game format. But I will say that I partly chose to play Ruby Amethyst at Atlanta because I do think it does very well in 2-game. I think it has great equity on the play. It has great equity on the draw, and its matchup spread is very, very smooth. Where when I spoke to Savige on the day, he brought blue-red to that tournament. Maybe question some of his decisions sometimes because running into super polarizing matchups on some ends, and then also being very polarized sometimes on the draw against decks like Green Steel while playing a control deck like that. For me, 3-game format actually has a much larger impact on the deck I pick. I'd be very unlikely to bring a deck like Blue Red, like set 3 Blue Red, to a best of 3 because I feel like it's very hard to finish 3 games against opposing Ruby Amethyst or Blue Red decks. So it's fascinating. There's a lot of theory behind it, but yeah. So ultimately, 2-game format you think is good. Maybe cut off the bonus point, and you think we have an optimal. What do you think about top cut 64 single limb? Would you rather have a day 2 Swiss into top 8 cut?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we would all rather.
Yeah, not a very contentious subject there.
No, there's just so much variance right now that basically you don't have enough Swiss rounds to reliably select the best players to advance, and then you have so many single elimination rounds that the very best player in day 2 might just have just one bad round and be out of it. I think that the current system is not likely to ultimately give the trophy to the best player in the room. And I know how ironic that is coming from the winner, but I honestly did not feel like I was, the best player in that room. I did my best, but yeah, I would like to see more Swiss rounds. Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm going to touch on the format a little bit more because I put out a tweet recently just talking about in Chicago. I actually looked at the whole format layout for the Lorcana Challenge, and it clearly actually states, I didn't realize, but clearly states that for every Lorcana Challenge, no matter the size, if it's 1,000 players or if it's 2,000 players, it will always be a top 64 cut, which I do find quite interesting because they've adjusted the pricing accordingly so that if it's 1,000 players, the prizes get adjusted. If there's more players, prizes get adjusted. But the top cut still never changes. So, for example, in Chicago, it was still top 64 for 1,000 players. So I don't want to use this word as like people had an easier run, but essentially, if you end up in that kind of between 32 and 64, right, it does seem a little bit strange.
Yeah, I have a hot take. Tournaments are never fair. It's just blatantly unfair there. So tournaments are never fair. There's always going to be a region that's softer than others. There's always going to be tournaments that are easier than others. Also, you have variability on the day in terms of who you pair into. Your pairings can be a lot easier than others. Your matchups can be better than others. Tournaments are never fair. At all. And also we can get into preparation, the people you have around you, the resources you have, a million variables that make tournaments fundamentally unfair. But when you look at something like top 64 in 1K and a 2K, it's like, okay, that tournament is clearly easier. Just mathematically. And I would agree with you. I would agree with you. But I don't think it's a problem because I think tournaments are already so unfair. They're just unfair in variables that people have, somewhat agency over and somewhat equity over, but also ones that they can't control. So
sure, I think for me, I'm after kind of thinking about it for a while, I kind of realized like it's not that much of a big deal. But in my mind, as that true competitive player, I'm like, oh, these guys are getting such an advantage, even though like, you know what I mean? Maybe it doesn't matter too much. Yeah. And also the way I was looking at it was because for Bochum, they announced that it's going to be a 3-day event, which I was actually very surprised about, but also happy because it means they can accommodate more players. And I do understand the reasoning that they're basically making turning a 2K into 2 1K events, and then there's top 32 that then make it to the Sunday that qualify. So they're still having essentially a top 64 cut for a 2K player event, just done separately. So like, yeah, I think just from that kind of fresh news, I was like, right, so I have to play in the 1K and it's not top 64. I guess I just have to top 32 to get into it. But hey, that's how it is. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just with the prizes being, if they're being cut in half, which I think they are, then I don't really think it makes too much of a difference because top 64, even if like 1K player cuts to top 64 instead of top 32, it isn't just an advantage. It's an advantage for the extra 32 players that made it in. It's a disadvantage for the first 32 players that now have to play an extra round of single elim. So like that kind of evens out the EV in that thinking.
Sure, I didn't think about that. That actually kind of makes sense. Yeah.
For Bochum, I think the split into 2 days is likely mainly due to venue restrictions.
It is, yeah. I know for a fact. I've heard confirmation that it is, yeah.
Yeah. I would expect that if they can get a big enough venue, then having one big event on Saturday and Sunday is superior for many players because, well, it just means that you don't have to take a day off work. Mm-hmm. But well, probably given the restrictions, this is the best setup we have.
So Frank,
also speaking about that, Frank,
we're going to get into that.
We're going to get to this, yeah.
All right. So, we're going to talk about more reasonable theory in the main topic. Should you play 60 cards? But let's talk about the bullshit theory. Frank, game theory wise, what is more optimal, playing on the Friday or playing on the Saturday? Do you go for when people have to take work off and when people, maybe can't travel? Like, what is the optimal day? What's going to be the easier day to play?
Yeah, well, I mean, from a game theory perspective, it shouldn't really matter depending on how you model it. But I would expect that maybe Saturday is going to be a little bit easier because that is where all the local players who were only able to come for that weekend, who are not willing to take extra days off, will participate. Friday will probably require a bit more dedication, especially if you were to travel to a tournament, and you might have just a busy job. Well, not everyone wants to do that, so only the very best players will make that dedication. I'm not entirely sure it is going to work out that way because the announcement was, made fairly close to the tournament. So maybe players had already actually booked all their travel and were only able to go on Saturday, for example. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
But
yeah.
then I took a strategy and I changed my travel. So I was one of the hardcore players, like you said, Frank. I was like, I'm going to play. So I find this really interesting, right? So like this takes it the layer deeper that what Frank says, I do actually agree with that. Like the more dedicated players realize that they will probably say, oh, I want to play on the Friday. Because in my mind, it's like, oh, well, most people, like you said, if they've booked stuff, they'll just come and play on the Saturday and stuff like that. But it's so funny because it takes it that layer deeper. I'm like, oh, I might have an advantage getting there on the Friday because not everyone can travel on the Friday, so maybe not. You know what I mean? It's really really interesting.
Card gamers play games, right? Like card gamers play games. Maybe they have less disposable resources and less agency over their schedule than like a normal working person. I get like there's a lot that goes into it. There was actually a comment on our YouTube video. It's like, what's the theory? What is the theory behind card gamers not being able to travel? Friday.
While this is like a very minor difference in the end, I think there's two more significant factors that you could consider going into this. One of them being, I don't think Top Cut is super like, okay, just making Top Cut, you don't gain a lot from that. You really want to do well in Top Cut. And if you get into Top Cut on Friday, you have an entire day of rest before Top Cut. So that's one thing. The other thing is maybe that won't be me. I will be ordering my deck maybe after this podcast. But if you have a full collection, you could have people scouting the Friday meta and somewhat adjusting what deck you're going to bring to the Saturday event. So those are like the two minor things.
That sounds very extreme, though. But
no, that's pretty reasonable. I don't even think that's extreme. That's pretty reasonable.
No, I do think those are both valid reasons. Another potential reason to choose one of the 2 days, like for me, a reason to choose Saturday, which is the ticket that I got, was that, well, I don't have much time to prepare, given that I have all kinds of obligations with Magic the Gathering coming up. This way, I actually can do some practice and preparation on Friday, play a couple side events maybe, or meet up with players, and then get into the weekend feeling more confident. So it kind of worked out for me that way. I think in the end it doesn't really matter much. And honestly, when I was booking my ticket, I was like, well, I probably have like a small preference for Saturday for practical reasons, but I expected things to sell out within a minute anyway. So just grab whatever you can get, and if you are able to get a ticket, then it's all good. Yeah. In the end, I believe Saturday sold out quickly, and then Friday tickets were still available for a little while, which I guess makes sense. But yeah.
Also, I think the smaller the margins between when you're making a decision, the smaller the margins between your options are. That usually means like the less the decision matters, but still the more time you could think about all the different factors. What's the better?
Yeah. It's just fun to imagine.
I've encountered this kind of theory a lot with team events. So team events, like you have 3 players on a team, and you have ABC, and you can place them in a certain order. And in Flesh and Blood, you have to pick a hero, so there can be polarizing matchups on the hero. And like there's game theory behind like who you put in the middle, right? Do you put the player that finishes the fastest on the fastest deck, is on the slowest deck, needs help from the 2 side players? Do you put your strongest player that can help the 2 players on the sides? Do you put your most unknown player on table A because that's the name that shows up in the pairing, and your opponents will have the least time to prepare as they see the name and walk towards the table? Ultimately, we just roll a dice because it doesn't matter. But there's so many factors. Anyway.
Yeah, I remember this from Magic tournaments as well, where like many teams wants to have the best player in the middle because you could discuss with your teammates and then give them advice both to the left and to the right. But and then there was some metagaming going on, like, ooh, what kind of deck might the best player play, and all that kind of stuff. When I did the best in a team event, I basically told my teammates, hey, I'm a bit of a slow player. I am not great at like playing multiple matches at the same time. You know what? Just put me to the side. I'll be on table C, and you two on table A and B. You guys can figure it out together, and that actually worked out perfectly.
Yeah.
So ultimately, in these situations, you just have to not go too deep, but just focus on your own strengths and weaknesses and optimize based on that.
Yeah, for sure.
Sure. All right. Next comment is from Arctic Eden. Do you have any tips for the Ruby Amethyst matchup against Ruby Sapphire? I'm going to target this one towards yourself, Brendan.
Well, it's actually, I want to give it to Moyen, because this is from the Ruby Sapphire perspective. Frank, we talked a lot about how the Ruby Amethyst matchup and the Ruby Sapphire specifically has gotten a lot better in set 4 due to the Flynn Riders and the Inkable Sisus. You one drop, whatever one drop you want. It could be Chernobog's Followers, could be the new Broom, 2-drop Flynn, 3-drop Sisu, 4-drop Castle. Good luck to your Ruby Sapphire opponent. They no longer have scars in their deck. Moyen, how do you deal with that curve?
If I go second, often I cannot deal with that curve. If I go first, it's often okay if you basically are able to, instead of take tempo off to remove the Flynn, you can ramp into something that has more strength than the Flynn. So that's one of the most important decisions to make in that matchup is, for example, they play Flynn. Do you brawl it? Do you play Quill? It depends on the context of your hand. But that's definitely one way. And then the next thing is, I think that matchup's easily lost by overreacting to, instead of letting them get some lore while setting up your own win con, because if you just slow them down as much as possible, that usually means you also give them more time. So like recognizing, when do I have the time to fit in the dime, the Tamatoa in a turn, to then be able to waste them instead of losing to them just playing a few cards each turn into some goats. Those would be the two main things, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, makes sense. Next one's from J Pram. I don't think banning Bookie is necessary. All it would do is create an even less diverse meta. It would probably just result in Sapphire Steel being the best positioned deck, since the matchup versus Ruby Sapphire is fairly even, and Sapphire Steel would crush the aggro that's targeting Ruby Sapphire. Yeah, I think just between the last like 3 weeks, people have just seen Emerald Steel and Bookie and all this Floodborn, and I think people are definitely overreacting. Like it's clearly a powerful thing, but I don't know, like at the time, a lot of the whole New World stuff was like super powerful as well. I know there's some people who have different opinions about that card, how powerful it is and stuff like that. But ultimately, I mean, this is a bit of a weird question to post to the group, but when do you ultimately think that, because we've seen a ban list mentioned in, I think it was in the comprehensive rules or something like that. When do you think ultimately they will make a move on banning a card? Would it literally have to be, okay, like, there's an egregious amount of green steel in a top cut. It's all Bookies. It's clear that this card is a huge problem. I guess I'll pass to you, Frank. Like compared to like any Magic cards that have been banned and stuff, what's kind of the process that you've seen over time in terms of like, it's clear that this card is a problem and needs to be dealt with?
So in my opinion, I never like bans much for physical card games, because they do come at a substantial cost of players who invest quite a lot of time and energy and collection into their decks, and having that all thrown out from under you is a real feel bad. So for me, the bar for banning should be very high, perhaps even to the point where there is a deck that either is completely dominant for a long period of time, let's say over 30 or 40% of the metagame all the time, or it's also clear that there is just no way to beat it, where ultimately it might even coalesce to a one deck format. I don't really think that is currently the case with Bucky, although it would be nice to have more answers for the card. That's actually why I think that maybe Sapphire Steel, to be honest, I haven't played that much with set 4 yet, but these decks with Tinkerbell and Grab Your Sword seemed like they might be good in theory against the Bucky decks, because those seem to be some of the best available answers, and ramping into them.
Yeah.
At least from a theory perspective, should be good against Bucky.
From a theory perspective, just in general, like zooming out, would you rather be the player with the answers or the player that's forcing the answer?
Well, from a theory perspective, it really depends on the specifics, on like the matchup numbers. From a personal perspective, well, everyone has their own playing style, and I just enjoy the more proactive decks if possible. So I would rather ask the answers than try to come up with the answers. There's a saying in Magic that there are no wrong threats, but there are wrong answers, and that's kind of behind the art of beatdown.
I guess the wrong threats are when you're already being threatened, and then your threats are useless.
Fair.
Yeah. What are your thoughts in general around the addition of Diablo to the game? Do you think that Diablo is the most powerful card in the game? It feels like a card that if it exists on the board for more than a turn or two, that it simply just accrues too much advantage. Like I think there is only one true must answer card in this game right now, and that is Diablo. You could argue Beast gets close, but I think that Diablo must be answered the turn after it comes down, or you basically lose.
Yeah, Diablo also costing 3 ink rather than 5 is a pretty big difference with Beast. Anytime I've had the card against me, when I didn't have an answer, it just felt completely ridiculous. It is possible to answer it in an effective way. For example, with Baboom, you effectively gain an ink, so that's a good answer. Or with Let the Storm Rage on, you effectively draw a card in the process, so that's also a good answer.
Well, for Let the Storm Rage on, just to clarify as well, the opposing player still gets the card as well.
If it's exerted.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's true.
If it's exerted, that is correct.
Yeah.
But then I guess so. Like Diablo, answering Diablo efficiently is pretty doable. Answering like the turn 2 shift Diablo after the Bucky efficiently is a lot harder. And for me, I don't think Emerald Steel is oppressive. I think both Ruby Sapphire and Sapphire Steel have like a very reasonable matchup into it. And still, for me, I wouldn't hate seeing it banned, I guess, because not because it's not. I don't think it has to be banned because it's oppressive. It's just like I personally don't find a lot of fun in playing the deck or playing against the deck. I think the deck takes a lot of decisions away from you.
Cardinal sin of card game design is like let's build a deck that just makes players lose agency and decisions. Yeah,
just discard your hand and then play must answer threats. But I already discarded your threats, so now you need to like draw into them. But if the Diablo's on the board, you can't really dig for them either.
Yeah, it's really interesting though, like because I think I mentioned this to you, Moin, when I first sat down and I just looked at the two decks, like the new Ruby Sapphire and Set 4 and Emerald Steel, I was like, if Set 3 was anything to go by, Emerald Steel should absolutely dominate. But a lot of the, maybe not a lot of the aggression, but like the Merfolks and the Flynns, they've kind of come out, so you're not maybe questing for as much. So you are kind of reliant on really getting your bookie discard package working. I mean, I found that the 3-drop Singer Ursula and Sudden Chill was actually a great way to deal with Ruby Sapphire discarding multiple cards. Because then also by playing that 3-drop Ursula, maybe they use the Brawl on that, and then you play the Diablo the turn after, or vice versa, or whatever. But I found the matchup to be quite close, honestly. I think we did see that from Chicago. I think there was a lot of red-blue in it was the top 16 and top deck. Yeah, it was the most represented deck. So I think the matchup is still incredibly close, but there's still no denying the power of Diablo for sure.
Yeah,
I think the versions with Sudden Chill can be dangerous because the way Ruby Sapphire often plays that matchup is trying to ramp by sustaining some sort of hand size, but often you can only sustain enough hand size to just like out the Bucky draws, where you can still keep the one Flower Charm in your hand. But then if there's a Sudden Chill on top of that, you might be at the mercy of the top decks from there on.
That's where we see the Stone Dragon come in. Frank, what's your opinion on removal in Lorcana? Do you think it's generally kind of bad? That's been my opinion. Most removal seems to be 1-for-1 at best, also a bit overcosted. I know Steel is probably the outlier there, but it does feel like our sort of threats and our the threats that we have access to, I think in general, on the aggregate, are more powerful than the answers that we currently have in the game. Seems like the answers are pretty tame.
I agree with that. Even in the first set, when I saw Dragonfire costing 5 ink, that kind of set the theme. Whereas in Magic, such a card would just cost 2 or 3 mana. And due to the similarities between the games, that was quite a disparity. On the whole, yes, the threats in the game are definitely better than the answers right now. And yeah, I can't think of a better threat than Diablo at the moment.
Yeah, they need to print Swords to Plowshares, and then we're chilling. That's for anybody who doesn't know, that's that would be a 1 inkable destroy character opponent gains lore equal to its cost. That'd be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they don't want hyper control decks. I think that was something they actually intentionally want to avoid. I think that Lorcana is a game that they want players to be able to play their cards and feel like they're impactful. And I think that's why we see our threats be they're definitely, our threats are a better rate than our answers for sure.
I heard from a bunch of players that they really hated the set 1 Ruby Amethyst Mirror hyper control matchup, and like that made them not want to play the game.
Yeah. But but those people can shut up. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, we were big fans of the Ruby Amethyst set 1. Which, by the way, I went back. I don't know. I mentioned this on a podcast. I went back and I played Amber Steel. Like the final version of the Amber Steel was the Ruby Amethyst. And the gameplay in set 3 and set 4 is so much better than set 1. Set 1, it was like so garbage compared to now. But I had a lot of fun. Anyway, on to the next one.
Before I just jump into the next comment, there's something I'll mention just after the spilled in section, which I think is quite interesting. I want to hear your guys' thoughts. It's a bit of further design space, but we'll get to that in a second. The next comment is from Hater Time. Some top players are moving away from Aerial and Blue Steel because they already have enough uninkables. Why play an extra 2 6-cost uninkables that don't impact the board? You could play an extra Grab Your Sword or Zeus if you want an uninkable. They're playing 4 Tamatoa and they can load up on Popsicle, Forward Sphere, Fishbone Quill, and 1 Lucky Dime on the field. It's already 5 lore. I think in Blue Steel, I personally, from the decks, I haven't seen a crazy amount. I haven't seen too many aerials in there. I think it seems to be quite good in Ruby Sapphire. That I've seen 1 or 2 of them. I've seen 1 or 2 included in that list, mainly because there are very, very few ways to answer it. That it can kind of come down. You put this kind of 2-turn clock on against your opponent. Obviously, that depends on the matchup. But Moyen, sorry, I know you were itching to say something there about.
No, I think I don't think it sees any play in Ruby Sapphire. I do think it's only played in Sapphire ST.
Yeah,
oh, interesting.
It does.
Okay,
it's true. I picked this question because I wanted to revisit everybody's favorite article here, and I want to ask Frank if he's adjusted his theory on the uninkable count index now that we're in set 4.
A little bit. So in the article that I guess you have referenced often, then I looked at a couple of perspectives on like how many inkables or non-inkables you can afford to play based on some hypergeometric probabilities. Looking at like being consistent enough to have enough ink by turn 6 or 7. Or trying to maximize the likelihood of like starting a hand with like 5 inkables and 2 uninkables, which felt like a good balance. Also trying to incorporate like mulligan strategies a little bit, and then ultimately I concluded that like between 15 and 19 uninkable cards is a reasonable proportion. The math on that, well, it still holds, of course, but I think one thing that I did not fully incorporate into those models is the value of flexibility. Because even if an inkable card might be substantially better than a wait. Even though a
Uninkable.
non-inkable card can be substantially better than an inkable card of the same cost, sometimes you draw multiples or have like other curve consideration, and just having the option of turning any card into ink means that you can just curve out more reliably, and also pick the best cards for the situation at hand. Taking that into account, I have enjoyed decks with slightly fewer non-inkables, but it still depends on the context. It's really a balancing act between figuring out the right number for your deck, while considering the relative impact of all the uninkables you can play. What are you currently using as a guideline?
So Moyen has like there's a very common thing that Moyen talks about when it talks about uninkables, and you have to look at uninkable S cards you must play. So when we talk a lot about uninkable tech cards, that's why we kind of stray away from them, is because I mean those are cards that you kind of just have to play outright, and if they're not flexible and if they don't fit multitude of situations, they can be pretty bad. In terms of the count, we're on the higher end. I'll say that. We are definitely on the higher end, but we're also playing Ruby Sapphire, playing a ramp deck, right? So we're playing a ramp deck that can also ink uninkable cards, after something like turn 3, because it has access to Fishbone Quill. But Moyne, what was the count in your Ruby Sapphire list? Anytime Moyne
my
puts a
last
list,
rank 1 list was 24, and
24,
people were outraged. But it's so the way I usually see it, and I've talked about this a lot, is where I don't have a certain uninkable count in mind, and I won't go above that. It's more like every uninkable count that you add after every further uninkable that you add has like a higher cost than the last one in terms of consistency. So like the cost incrementally gets higher as you go higher in the uninkable costs. For Ruby Sapphire, it's very interesting because you do need to be able to mulligan aggressively for your keycards, and a lot of them are uninkable with like one jump ahead, how far I go. And so there's some risk in that, but at the same time, a hand like that contains one jump ahead, how far I go, let's say an opening hand with 5 and your entire mulligan is like 5 uninkables, 2 inkables. That's a very playable hand. All you need in the first 3 turns is like to draw 1 more ink, and you're already making it to the how far I go. The how far I go can pick ink. Then you have like 5-6 ink for turn 4, and a lot of some of the uninkables will be playable for those turns, and you just have that resource advantage. Mm-hmm. So that generally still works out for you. But regarding, I think that this comment was kind of funny because it was people are moving away from an uninkable because they already have enough uninkables. Whereas it's inherently you don't want uninkables just because they're uninkables. So it's not like never like you want to put in this many and then it's enough. And also, why play this uninkable if you could play the others? Yeah, because this uninkable does something else than the others. It's not all uninkables want to be removal. This uninkable would be a tech card that's really good in the Sapphire matchups to waste them. It's not like uninkables have to be removal, or if you want you can't play an uninkable threat because you could play more uninkable removal instead. I feel like that doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, I do agree. First of all, for using a high number of uninkable cards in the deck with Fishbone Quill, that makes a lot of sense to me. And indeed, cards like One Jump Ahead, they're cheap and they provide ink, so they don't really count as like a full uninkable in my mind. And in addition, when you have card draw in your deck, you can also afford like a larger fraction of uninkables. And when it comes to the number of or the distribution of your uninkable cards, I think an important aspect is the idealized curve that you want to hit. Mm. For example, you might say, "Hey, I want, let's say, 6 big characters to work with the Lucky Dime." Right? In that case, you would just play 4 Tamatoa and 2 copies of Ariel. And figuring out that exact number and balancing it versus like the total number of, say, removal spells that you can run, that requires some deck building practice. but that is definitely where you can find the weird numbers, the 1 of, the 2 of, uninkable to hit the desired spots of all the types of cards that you want in your deck.
Mm-hmm. I have pretty strong opinions on uninkable tech cards in particular. So I think that they are generally quite bad unless you are really trying to metagame for something very specific. One thing that happened to me a lot, sort of in the lead up to Atlanta and Lille, was I posted a list that had done very well for me at Set Championships. It was Ruby Amethyst list. And I would have people message me back about it. They would say, "Hey, I love your list. I'm going to play in this tournament. And I've added Book and 2 Scars." And I'm like, that's a different list. That's a totally different list. Because I think that Book is a bad card. And a bad card in the Ruby Amethyst mirror. For one, because I think that the mirror is highly tempo based and finding time to play a Book is very hard to do. Sometimes when Book is down, you'll find yourself already winning that game. But also Book is, it just kind of is what it is. It can look good because it's a win condition, but I don't think it's ultimately a good card. Also, you can't play a Book against green steel. Like, it's just terrible. It's just terrible. So, I don't know. That's the thing. It's like uninkable tech cards must be played. And if you're expecting a metagame that has a lot of green steel, I just don't think you can be running around the Ruby Amethyst list that has this absolutely dead draw in your deck.
Okay, but we are talking about set 3 metagame, right?
Set 3, yes. Set 3.
No way it was not good in the mirror. It was.
I don't actually think it's good in the mirror. I tested it a lot in paper. I think that much better in the mirror is just tempo. I think that if you draw it late in the mirror, it can be okay, but I think that is at best. And I think that the Ruby Amethyst mirror is often decided in the first 5 turns anyway.
No, but I don't agree. It's just, I guess the Ruby Amethyst mirror in set 3. Okay, now we already don't matter, but we made an entire video on how good Book is.
Yeah, I made a complete thumbnail with Sorcerer's Spellbook, the answer for the mirror.
And because I think maybe, personally, I think you might be biased because your opponents weren't playing for tempo enough and dropping it and sacrificing tempo for it, but it's more like this card that wins you the game mid to late game if you were able to keep up in the early game and then played for tempo until you get to that stage where Book's great. Book 7 ink, 8 ink was an absolute great card in the mirror, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think ultimately it wasn't needed, and that also, you're right, when you misplay tempo on Book, let's say you drop it on something like turn 3, or maybe even turn 8 when you should be doing something else, it can often lose you the game because what I found a lot better than Book was asking very hard questions with mini castle or clearing castles efficiently, bouncing my goats, stuff like that. I just felt like ultimately the card wasn't good enough. And also, again, the core concept here is uninkable, an uninkable tech card. I think if you ran into a set 3 metagame that had a lot of green steel in it, unplayable. I just think it's such a risk, such a risk. Yeah. And same thing with the Scars too. Scar was the
okay. The main point being here, uninkable tech cards will hurt you a lot in the other matchups that you're not taking for. But I just didn't want it to sound like it wasn't a good tech card for the mirror.
Yeah, and this is also in a sense why I in my Steel Song deck in Lille favored Piglet over Sleepy's Flute or Pride Lands. These kinds of more aggressive 2-drops that you don't really want to focus on the draw or against other reasonably fast decks. You really want them to be inkable. And yeah, I do think it matters a lot in deck construction.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Our final comment is from Jerry Damage. What are your takes on the top 64 being open deck lists, but the deck lists being incorrect and in some cases completely wrong? From my understanding, it happened in both Atlanta and Chicago, and both times they were errors from the judges / staff who put them in after a long day. In my opinion, it puts their opponents at a disadvantage since the opponent's deck lists are known, but theirs isn't. But since the error often isn't discovered until the game has begun, I'm not sure what the correct resolution is at that point. I heard about this, but this is the first time I've kind of delved deeper into it.
Sounds like a logistic
Were you familiar
error
with this happening, Brendan, in Atlanta at least? I heard more about it happening in Chicago, but I'm not too sure.
No. I did. But also I missed day 2 by a game, so it wasn't relevant for me. But I assume that the deck list they submitted versus what they were playing was not actually incorrect. It was just a logistical error, and yeah, that's just.
Yes.
There was plenty of errors in terms of logistics. We played what? I don't know how many rounds of Swiss did we play? Not many, and it took 12 hours.
Oh yeah, Lille was even before America started. We were like, okay, it's what was it like a 40-minute wait between rounds at one stage? Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Oh man.
But okay, there can be lots of logistical errors, but I think this one I would deem unacceptable when you are effectively taking someone's chances in top cuts or like minimizing someone's chances because of that mistake. So I think this is a really harsh mistake that should not happen in the future.
Yeah.
I know in Lille in day 2 the way it worked is that the judges made photocopies of all the paper deck lists that we submitted, and then at the start of every round they handed the deck list out to everyone. And I got like my own deck list. They said, well, just check this is your deck list. I said, yep, that seems accurate. And then afterwards we exchange it with the opponent. So unless I had a deck list error, which a deck check would catch and would come with appropriate penalties anyway, there was not really a possibility for errors in that process. So I'm not entirely sure what went wrong in Atlanta or Chicago. I do agree it would not be acceptable and put someone at like potentially huge disadvantage, which is unfair. But with the right processes, I think those should be possible to avoid.
Yeah.
I will give everyone some leeway because these are also like the very first events. The staff in Lille was great, but yeah, people were still also learning all the processes. I think as more challenges happen, there are less likely to be errors.
I saw this comment and I saw comments that came after it. And I think a lot of people are speculating that the decks that people are playing were actually different from like what they had submitted. In which case, there are like Frank mentioned, there is appropriate penalties for that. I think it was just a issue on the staffing end, not the player end submitting incorrect decks. So yeah, hopefully they fix it for the future. I'm sure they're aware it's a huge problem. Like it is a real problem, but I don't think it's a mistake they would make more than once. Anyway, let's hop into. Oh, yeah. If you want to get your question read on next week's podcast, just come out on YouTube. Get it queued up for this building. Set 4. We're going to talk about a little bit about the Set 4 metagame in Chicago, but mostly we're going to be talking about just theory and fundamentals. First thing I want to talk about before we get into that, though, is Frank, how did you end up on Amber Steel for Lille?
So I was kind of inspired by the deck I brought to a store championship or set championship, whatever the official name is, where I just brewed up a hyper aggro Amber Amethyst deck with like all the high lore characters, and well, somehow it worked. It was kind of a metagame gamble. Piglet was the card I liked a lot in that deck, so that stuck with me. But then I did feel that deck ultimately had a bit too much of a play-draw disparity to take it into the 2-game format. Steel Song was a deck that I had played all the way back to set 1 when I did a bit of Constructed. I really loved the interaction between Ariel, Spectacular Singer, and A Whole New World. Just raw power. And yeah, it was just a deck with a smooth curve of powerful characters, strong interactions, and a play style that appealed to me. So it wasn't really like a big like metagame call, but rather focusing more on experience and familiarity. That was more the deciding factor in my deck choice.
Would you make the case that it was the most powerful deck in set 3? Now that we've sort of had the post-mortem on that set?
I don't feel confident enough to make that claim or to define most powerful, because this is a game where there is pretty much a way to answer anything that exists. So yeah, I generally don't really talk about stuff like best deck or most powerful deck, because it's all like contextual. It all really depends on what the metagame is like.
Mm-hmm.
It is a deck with a lot of raw power that is still there in set 4, but it didn't really gain much. So I'm kind of rambling here, but honestly, I don't really have an answer. I don't know.
Yeah, it was a deck that I saw a lot of players favor, and a deck that I think we rated
I
a
saw
bit lowly.
more of it than I anticipated. In Lille, at least, I saw a lot of Amber Steel, which I was a little bit surprised about because I thought that maybe people wouldn't opt for it if there was that much red blue coming. But then also, I know some people were a little bit unsure if they should play red blue over something a little bit more consistent like Ruby Amethyst because it has that kind of better matchup spread over a large amount of games. So I probably didn't anticipate as much as there was. And for me personally, it was my ultimate downfall because my final 3 rounds were against all Amber Steel and it my worst matchup. But yeah,
yeah, it's 2,000 player tournament though. Like, I mean, it can go a million different ways.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, you sit down, and you look across, you're like, oh, I wish I had that matchup over there.
Yeah,
you know,
matchup variability is
that's how it
super
goes.
high.
Yep.
Interesting. Yeah, for sure. I wonder if Magic players tend to gravitate towards cards that are, they're clear callbacks to things like Wheel of Fortune, and see a card like that and maybe prefer, or just, I don't know, maybe extrapolate the power that you used to have in a game like Magic to something like Lorcana, where maybe players like us that haven't played with that card very much underappreciated a bit.
I do think it is inherently very powerful. You just need to have a deck with a rather low curve or, a way to break the symmetry.
Yeah, 100%. All right. Well, let's get into theory. And to start that off, I want to ask you the most hotly debated topic in Lorcana for God knows a year. 60 cards. The minimum
Every
card
week
count
we
in
get
Lorcana.
comments on this.
Yeah, the
every
minimum
week.
card count in Lorcana. Why justify, or I don't know. Why would you ever play above the minimum card count?
Well, I do like this topic indeed. Generally speaking, you want to play 60 cards, stick to the minimum to just increase the chances of drawing your best cards as much as possible. It's all consistency. Now there are a few possible reasons to play more than 60. At least in Magic the Gathering, this sometimes happens where you have a toolbox deck with a lot of cards that you would prefer not to draw, but you have a bunch of like tutors, right? Cards that say search your deck for a certain card, and then you have like a whole slot of one-offs or cards with certain characteristics. And in rare situations, there can be decks where you can only make the numbers work by going over 60.
Can you dig a little deeper into what make the numbers work means?
Then I would have to give an example from Magic, but there was a deck, for example, based around Scapeshift, a card that said that meant that you want to search for 7 mountains in your deck, along with a card called Valakut to win the game. So you needed those slots in your deck, but you also needed enough blue sources for cryptic commands, like a very high blue heavy card. And the only way to make the mana ratios work to get like reasonable opening hands was to increase the land count, increase the number of cards, because you needed that certain setup for Scapeshift. That was one example.
And is this like hypergeometric math on the being able to get a certain ratio of these lands to be able to cast these cards, or what kind of math are we talking about when it comes to the ratios?
It's basically in this example, and this was for the Magic players, Scapeshift deck by Hall of Famer Makihito Mirara, that ran I think 66 cards, almost like over a decade ago. So it doesn't come up often. Basically, you wanted a certain fraction of lands to be blue producing. ideally 75% for a card called Cryptic Command.
Mhm.
And yeah, you needed enough mountains in your deck just for the card Scapeshift to win the game. And yeah, then if you need like 7 mountains, but you want a certain fraction of your mana base to be blue producing, yeah, it kind of cascades into something.
And those numbers that
but-
we're getting to, like 75% blue sources, were those sort of, did the player come up with those? Were they arbitrary, or how did they come to, like, we need 75% blue sources to be able to cast Cryptic Command?
Yeah, I'm not sure it was like exactly 75
It's okay. I was just wondering how we get to
percent,
the
but
fundamental number.
I think even then it was based on the players' choices, and also a hotly contested and debated thing.
Yeah.
I expect that it is also like I think they actually wanted to go beyond 66 to optimize these mana ratios that I mentioned, but they also wanted to keep enough consistency of drawing their key card Scapeshift. So there was kind of a balancing act in there, and it was not clear how to weigh those two aspects.
Okay.
But there was at least some theory behind going over 66. Now, I had been going very deep into this specific example, but I have to highlight that this was, something from over a decade ago.
Yeah.
That happens once every few years, and there can be reasons to play more than 60 to optimize your mana base, but it is not clear. And when we come to Lorcana,
there's no lands in Lorcana, right? So that probably changes a little bit. Yeah.
And also, there aren't really any good tutor cards that require some kind of toolbox of one-offs. So this whole idea does not really apply to Lorcana as it stands right now.
So in Lorcana, I guess it sounds like you wouldn't go over 60, but one thought experiment that I like to have is, I guess it's different for depending on the deck, but one thought experiment I like to have is how little cards would I put into my deck if the maximum, if the minimum wasn't 60. Like if, let's say, if the minimum was like 20, how little cards would I play?
How about no minimum?
What would the optimal deck
why any
size
minimum? How about no minimum? Well,
yeah.
How many cards did you
there's
put in
no
your deck
minimum.
if there was no minimum card count?
Yeah. And I think it's a difficult question.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, I'm not sure if there are consistency game-winning combos in Lorcana, but if there are, then I don't know, playing like a 14-card deck where you have your game-winning combo by a certain turn every single game, that might also become an issue. I don't know how that would work out, but I would like to continue with some other reasons to potentially play more than 60, because this like toolbox mana base kind of thing is like very specific and like rarely comes up. So one reason is that you're just either memeing for like fun numbers like 66, or you are like superstitious and need your deck to be a prime number. These are not good reasons, I'll say.
These are prevalent reasons in the Lorcana community, though.
Yes. Another reason could be that you kind of build a deck of, I don't know, 61 or 62 cards, and you really do not know what to cut, and you fear that cutting the wrong card can do more harm than just keeping the deck as is. This is still not a good theoretical reason to go beyond 60, because there is a worse there is a worst card to shave. But if you just really cannot tell, sometimes it's better to stick to 61 or 62 than to cut 2 cards that actually end up being completely wrong.
Yeah, the lesser of two evils.
But if you have enough time to prepare and test, this should not come up either. Even though in Magic, Pro Tours have been won by 61 card decks, where the player gave this exact reason. So historical precedent. I think the main reason in the current game of Lorcana that I would accept as okay, you can play a couple more cards than 60 is because you fear getting decked out due to, for example, a whole new world. This requires you to have like a specific read on the metagame, or perhaps play a whole new world yourself in a deck. But this could be a valid reason if losing to decking actually happens in a reasonable fraction of games.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in Lille, one of the rounds I played, at some point I was super far behind. My opponent's board state was overwhelming, but I counted their library and was like, well, okay, 14 cards. Well, so if I play a whole new world, or maybe I even had to find it with Ariel first, and then find a whole new world that actually gives me a backdoor way of winning the game. And yeah, I indeed found those cards on top of my deck and stole the game from out of nowhere. If my opponent had played one more card in their deck, well, they probably would have won that game. So,
can I ask what you were facing, Frank, in that matchup by any chance? Do you know what deck you were playing against?
I think that was Sapphire Steel, to the best of my recollection.
I do believe that is that interaction is quantifiable, though, because you could place a theoretical number on the amount of times in which you would encounter that scenario, and in which playing the additional card would win the game, and then you can assign a value to the percent in which it depreciates your deck's consistency just in general, and how many games you might be losing, and how much edge you might be losing by adding that one additional card. So you weigh up those two values, and obviously all the math is made up, but then you can make a clear decision there, right? Because it is relatively quantifiable, that interaction, I think.
Yeah, I think it would still be extremely difficult to quantify, because like it's like very, very minor impact both ways.
Yeah, a lot of players make the case. I want to bring this up. Is people come up to me and go, "It's not that bad. 61, 62, it's not that bad." I agree with that. I agree with that.
They are correct.
I agree with that. But in a card game, why would you ever take an X% negative edge when you don't have to? There's a minimum card count, not a max. We're going to the minimum. So even if it is 0.001 or 0.0002 or some infinitesimally small value, why would you ever take it? And that's kind of like, that's my current butt up against the 60 plus card debate is nobody can give me it's like X% better. They're always like, it's just not that bad. And I'm like, okay.
The whole new world argument would already be, okay, maybe it's 0.001% better for that reason.
Yeah.
If they were like, well, I will say if they were, I want to say proper mill decks, there's some. Remember, Brendan, you said even before the game came out, whatever, you were looking at like green steel mill. Really, really, when their whole game plan.
Ruby Amethyst used to go to mill all the time. Like set one, early set one, all the time. People were playing 66, 67.
Yeah, early set one, there was like 66 card list, 64 card list, because that's gonna.
Yeah, Pongo. Good luck. Yeah, good luck. Good luck. It's just, it's an interesting topic because it is prevalent. You look at a top 64 at a major Lorcana challenge, there is a significant non-zero amount of decks that have over 60 cards in them. And in my opinion, I believe that as time progresses and as we, go to future challenges, I think that number will be smaller and smaller and smaller. I do think that the 60 card deck will sort of prevail in the long term. I want to ask you, Frank, about that.
I agree.
Yeah, okay. About that Pro Tour player, the Scapeshift player. Say that Magic is going to host an exhibition. They're going to run back the metagame of said Pro Tour where the player did well with Scapeshift, the 66 card Scapeshift, in 2024, $1 million on the line. But they say one stipulation: Frank, you must play Scapeshift. You must play Scapeshift deck. Are you playing 66 cards?
Perhaps I would be open to testing that seriously. In fact, I believe, and then I get a bit into Magic, but that is still my main game. In the current modern format, I think many decks could be slightly better by running slightly over 60 cards, because it allows them to optimize the fetch land, shock land ratio of their mana base, and thereby improve their mana base. I genuinely think that in Magic, not enough players play more than 60 cards, because it is so ingrained into them that 60 is correct, that they don't even consider the possibilities where it might not be. I think in Lorcana, it might be the opposite.
Yeah.
Where I fully agree with your assessment that, players saying, hey, 61 or 62, it's not that much worse. True, but unless you expect a whole new rule decking to come up often, sticking to 60 will be better. And you would do well to just improve your chances of drawing your best cards.
Okay.
I think if you play more than 60 cards and you make top cut, you should be like DQ'd in top cut, and then your opponent wins.
Yeah, you have to do a public apology on Twitter if you.
Have some respect for the game.
I want to drill down. Like, I know it's Magic, and I know it's a different game, and I know not everybody listens to Magic, or knows about Magic, listens to this podcast. But I just want to drill down to that specifically, because it's not that hard to understand, even if you don't understand Magic. So you're talking about optimizing the ratio of a mana base with fetch lands and shock lands. These are, lands that can grab other lands, or lands that come into play untapped if you pay a certain price with your life. My question is, I understand that. I understand optimizing ratios. So we've determined that we want to have X% to do this. How do we get those X%? How do we get the initial ratios? How do we get to that? Because I understand optimizing towards said ratio, but how do you get the foundation of that? How do you get that I need this ratio of shock lands and fetch lands in my deck? How does the initial concept that we're optimizing towards?
In this specific example, the idea is more you want a fixed number of fetchable lands that give you all the options, right? You want to have, let's say, 5 or 6 fetchable lands in your deck, because these are the ones that you want to choose from all game. But you would rather not draw them. You would rather draw your tutors. So, well, effectively, the more tutors, the fetch lands you can play, the better it is for the average opening hand, because you will be able to find the right lands more often. And then figuring out what the ideal ratio is, then indeed we get to kind of a balancing act between getting a higher fraction of fetch lands versus drawing your best cards more frequently. And that can often be decided by looking at how much better are your best cards than the alternatives, right? Taking it to Lorcana, if you play a deck with Diablo, which we've described before is just super powerful and way better than anything else, just stick to 60. You want to have that card in your opening hand, same with Bucky. But if you are playing a deck with a lot of different answers or cards that are kind of interchangeable in terms of power level, then, well, going beyond 60 would not be as bad. Still,
as bad.
Still bad.
Yeah.
If I can give another fun example from
sure.
Magic, and who knows, maybe the next set will have these types of cards. Way back in, and this is in 2002, at a Pro Tour, at some point, various players showed up with an 88 card deck, because they played a card called Psychotalk, which allowed you to take out cards from your graveyard to get a boost. And a card called Traumatize, which would put the half of your library into your graveyard. And they kind of counted it up in a way that, if we play 88 cards, then you can play Traumatize and fill your graveyard to a substantial enough size to immediately win the game in one turn with Psychotalk. So if in Lorcana we would see these kinds of types of cards, I don't think they exist yet. Something to keep in mind for the future.
Yeah, that's the best example. That's the best example so far. That sounds super reasonable. I like that one.
Yeah.
My question with there is, so the card that splits the deck in or puts it into the graveyard or whatever, like in that type of deck, are there already cards that can tutor for that card specifically, or is that just I still have to draw said card? That makes sense.
I think they still had to draw it, and it also meant that they really reduced their probability of drawing their key Psychotalk win condition in the first place. And
that's what's wild to me.
Yeah. The upside of milling like upward of 40 cards doesn't really matter if you don't draw the Psychotalk in the first place. So actually, this example, while it made sense in theory, was probably a bit too cute. I think the player who there were actually multiple players who played the deck, but they left the tournament with 0 wins. So that kind of innovation was not a success story. But still, it was memorable enough that it contributed to the theory of there can be reasons of playing more than 60 cards. But for the most part, they have not worked out very well in Magic, and I fear the same holds for Lorcana as well.
My day would be ruined if I lost to an 88 card warrior 2 combo pieces OTK deck. One question we had coming up from time to time was, okay, so if you want to play 60 cards for maximum consistency, why do you not play 4 of every single card in your deck? Why do you play 3 offs, 2 offs, 1 offs of certain cards? And I think we talked about it a lot, but I would like to get your take on it as well.
So there are a lot of potential reasons for how many copies you want to play of a certain card. Indeed, 4 copies means that you just want to draw the card as often and as early as possible. But if you play a card as like a 3 of or a 2 of, it could be a card that you would like to see once at some point, but you would prefer not to draw multiples, especially early on, because when you run 4 copies of a card, you will find it quite often. In fact, if you in the mulligan process, if you were to bottom all 7 cards in search of a 4 of, you have 14 draws to see it, and would actually find it roughly 2/3 of your games. So there's high consistency possible there, but it also comes with a likelihood of drawing multiple copies, and especially when it comes to uninkable cards, it can be a bit awkward to draw multiple copies of the same uninkable, because it may have you priced into playing off curve in a way that you don't really want. Another reason to potentially end up with say 2 copies or 3 copies is that you first in deck building first stipulate an ink curve, right? I want this many 1 drops, this many 2 drops, this many 3 drops, and so on, to kind of smoothen out the cards over all the different costs in a way to maximize the probability of using all of your ink resources every turn. And then, well, if you say, I don't know, I want 10 2 drops, well, that means you're playing probably 4 copies of 2 of the best ones, and then 2 copies of something else to make those curve numbers work out. So these can be potential reasons for playing fewer than 4 copies of a card.
One reason I always like to state, which is basically it's a deck building theory where if you have cards of very interchangeable power level, you would actually prefer to have different cards, especially with the inking system and their inkables, because basically the way I see it is, if the power level is basically the same, then most cards don't synergize with themselves, and basically the second copy of that card is almost always going to be worse than the first copy of that card. And if they have the same power level, you'd rather have more options, have different cards. So I think there's a lot of value in having more different cards, and instead of 4 offs, if the card pool, which right now it's quite small, but if the card pool was bigger and there was cards that would be very similar in power level.
Yeah, I really like that.
Very good point and fully agreed.
Yeah.
This is actually why I often have like a bunch of 1-offs and 2-offs in my deck, just to get more flexibility. It requires a bit of tuning, but honestly, when I see a deck with lots of 1-offs and 2-offs, I often think, well, this is like a very well tuned and thought out deck, rather than, oh, this is just a random collection.
And I think for lots of people that are even like deep in trading card games, I don't want to say that they don't get it, but I feel like they are the opposite, where they would think, oh, a deck's only got if it plays lots of 4-offs and no 1-offs.
That's definitely me. He's talking about me. So I'm not sold on that, completely, but I prefer 4-offs. I think those lists for me, they represent, usually I would look at those lists as more tuned than 1-offs and 2-offs, because I think players will take extremely small sample sizes and make drastic changes to their deck. And that's, they can change a card here, change a card there, and they don't actually have a sample size that's representative of just biased off of like a recent result. I also I love Moyne's concept that the second, third, and fourth card have differing values than the first card. But my opinion on most cards in games is like, I almost believe there is no true replacement value in cards, and that cards have an absolute value that you could assign to them that represents all potential matchups and all potential, games you could play in a metagame if you could expand it out infinitely and you could assign this absolute value to the card. And there are cards that are just more powerful than others. That's sort of my theory. But it kind of falls apart when you talk about second card, third card, fourth card value versus first card value. Yeah. My opinion is that people who, or like in general, when people look at cards as replacement level value, or they look at them as similar in power level, they're actually just misunderstanding the power level of the card. Because like if we could take an infinite sample size of all matchups that your deck could play in a metagame, like there would be cards that are just more powerful on the aggregate because X percent is, it's better in the blue red, and blue red is X percent of the metagame. And if we had infinite sample size, like we could assign these true values.
So the way I think about it is like, it's not like they're exactly the same, but if the power level is close enough, there's still reason to split the copies between these two different cards because of that theory where drawing multiples is pretty bad.
Yeah.
It really has to be where the power level is super similar. I think that is essential. I think everyone here will still agree that for the couple of best cards in your deck, you will always play it as a 4-off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or best card, at least the ones that you want to draw as much and as often as possible. Let's say it that way.
Yeah.
Diablo, yes.
Yeah, there was an interesting decision made in set 3, and I'm sure it's going to be made in set 4 a bit, but it's like the split between Madame Medusa and Lady Tremaine and something like a Ruby Amethyst deck. So Lady Tremaine will deal with threats that the Ruby Amethyst deck in set 3 couldn't deal with. It now has a King Undisputed, so it does have these edict effects to deal with something like Tamatoa, but previously it literally could not deal with Tamatoa. Tamatoa comes down on the board, you need Lady Tremaine, you need to be prepared. So people would go up for 3-2 splits or 4-1 splits, and what I ended up with was a 4-0 split, which feels really bad because I opened my deck up to unanswerable questions that my opponent can ask via something like a Tamatoa or an Ariel. But my case is that scenario itself is so niche and, across many, many games that I could play, that I should simply just play the better card, which is Madame Medusa, because it has larger metagame implications. It can hit more things on the aggregate. So I've completely taken out my ability for my deck to deal with this, this threat that exists that I will lose to, but I've taken what, if I could assign those absolute values to these cards, what is the better card, and just made it a 4-of instead of splitting.
Yeah, I think that actually makes sense with uninkables, because say if these cards were inkable, then on turn 6 you could just choose which one to play and ink the other one based on the situation. But given that they're uninkable, you don't really have that flexibility, and then playing a 4-0 split based on the one that you think is best makes a bit more sense.
Mm-hmm. You talked a lot about playing on curve and building a curve in a deck. What are your thoughts on the card Develop Your Brain? One costs inkable, look at the top two, one in the hand, one at the bottom. It's often seems to be an almost auto include as a 4-of in a lot of these ramp decks. Moyne and I often cut it at one point in a Ruby Sapphire deck because we felt like we were playing on curve more often than not, and that this opportunity cost of playing under curve even on one turn on one ink was very high. We've opted to go back to Develop Your Brain because because some of those cards are so overwhelmingly powerful that you would maybe sacrifice one ink in order to search deep in your deck for them. What are your thoughts about a card like Develop Your Brain that you sacrifice this one ink, which I think is a real cost, to effectively cantrip and look 2 cards into your deck?
For many regular decks, I would not really like to run these types of cards. I would rather use all of my ink to affect the board, especially early on. However, if indeed you have cards that are way, way, way better than others, I don't know, Fishbone Quill comes to mind, and a deck where, spending that one ink on turn 1, you weren't really going to use it on anything else anyway, sure, it's fine. However, this is best used in decks that have cards that can kind of get back tempo. For example, Grab Your Sword or Be Prepared. Because then spending the ink to not affect the board early on is not as bad, because you have these cards that can sweep and get you back.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic because the card is extremely innocuous in terms of its effect on the game and its power. It's hard to evaluate, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Go ahead, Wayne.
For Develop Your Brain, there's also some math that's, I think, is very interesting on whether or not to keep it in the mulligan if you're looking for specific cards. And I haven't actually done the math, but for example, in Ruby Sapphire, where you play 4 Popsicle for Develop Your Brain, and you're looking for that 1 jump ahead, I think it just makes sense. You have to throw it away, because you have, even when throwing it away, if you're throwing because usually if you don't have 1 jump ahead, you're throwing a decent amount of your hand back into the deck, and then you have 1 more card that you're digging for by throwing it away, and still you only have this 1 spare ink before the turn 2 anyways, and you're very likely to still be able to play like a Popsicle or the Develop Your Brain anyways. And if you throw it away and you find a Popsicle, that means you kind of digged for the same amount of cards as if you kept it and would have played Develop on 1, but you already have the Popsicle in play where there's some advantage. If you throw it away and you get a Develop Your Brain, you still you're digging for 1 more card if you play the Develop on 1 just to find the 1 jump on 2. So just I felt like I was pretty sure that throwing it away is worse, but I guess you could technically do the math on how much better that is to throw it away.
Yeah, I think it will actually depend on how many cards you are tossing in total.
Mhm.
Because if you indeed say you're looking for the 1 jump ahead, if you were to mulligan 6,
Mhm.
or if the choice is between mulliganing all 7 or mulliganing 6 and keeping Develop Your Brain,
Mhm.
then if you are running 8 1 ink cards that draw deeper into your deck, you might be better off mulliganing all 7, because the likelihood of finding one of those 1 drops is already super high, and then getting an extra look at 1 jump is worth it. Whereas if you are keeping some other good cards and considering to mulligan only, I don't know, 2 or 3 cards,
Mhm.
I would I would almost surely keep the guaranteed 1 drop.
Yeah.
So I don't know where the inflection point is, but
because I think in Ruby Sapphire right now, if you don't have the 1 jump, often you mulligan 6 or 7-ish cards. So I think in that case, I like to throw it away, and because in that deck that is the case, I think Develop Your Brain is only ever really kept if you have a good hand and you need ink.
Mm-hmm. So
I'm just checking hypergeometric numbers right now, because let's say you have 8 copies of like a 1 ink card, like Popsicle or Develop Your Brain. Then there's around 65% probability to have 1 in your opening hand. I guess the numbers for mulligan can be slightly different, but 65 is not all that high actually. So maybe I would just keep the Develop Your Brain, just to be sure that you have something to do on turn 1. Might ultimately be better. No,
it's interesting. Moyne and I kind of have this running not super solid theory, but it's basically that Lorcana is a lot like chess, and that's kind of a big thing that people are missing due to the power of the mulligan and the flexibility of the cards. We found that once we really dove into testing specific matchups, that we could really sort of play to very specific openers, and there was very specific openers that depending on the opposing deck, they really could not deal with, or they would need something that's more narrow than me mulliganing for my narrow opener. So I would mulligan for my narrow opener as 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop mini, 4-drop mini, and then my Ruby Sapphire opponent would need to find, one jump ahead into Medusa. And then so if I also go 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop mini, 4-drop castle, my opposing Ruby Sapphire also needs to play 1 jump ahead and also needs to ramp into the Scar. And if it doesn't ramp into the Scar, it just loses, because there's like a critical minimum amount of lore that I can get by going mini or mini castle that I will simply accrue no matter what. And if my opposing doesn't answer it on that turn specifically, like, I will just win the game. We found this a lot actually in the Ruby Amethyst mirror in set 3. 1-drop, 2-drop Cusco, 3-drop mini, 4-drop mini on the play. Your opposing Ruby Amethyst player simply has what it feels like to be one answer. Now, one answer was like mini on turn 3, opposing mini crab, clear your mini, and then maybe bounce a crab, do it again. Other than that, by the time that my opponent could get the 6 ink or even get the 7 ink, I've simply accrued too much lore that I will just win the game, whether it's through a goat, it's through a bounce, or something like that. And in this instance, card advantage doesn't matter at all. As soon as my opponent plays a Maleficent on turn 3, they play a turn 4 Rabbit, I've won the game. Like, it is completely over. And we're talking about some of the best cards in Ruby Amethyst, right? Like, Rabbit's like your best card. Bouncing your Rabbit, that's like the best thing you can do. Singing friends on the other side, you're getting so much value, but they simply can't keep up with the tempo, and their deck isn't designed to do it as well. So our idea, and what we did is Moyen opened up the notepad and started writing down the turn 1, 2, 3, 4 plays. And we were mulliganing for specific things. And I was like, oh, if he has 1 jump ahead, then he can kind of keep up. He can answer this. You know what we found? He had it every fucking time because he's mulliganing 7 cards. So he had it 7 out of 8 times. And I also had my crazy opener like 6 out of 8 times. And I think that's a huge inflection point in Lorcana, and like a big change in sort of strategy is having these sort of macro game plans or these micro game plans that you can specifically play towards in a matchup, because exactly how their deck can and cannot answer it on the draw. And simply the math comes down to, I am more likely to find this kind of opener than my opponent is to find the answer. And that's assuming my opponent knows to even look for the answer.
Yeah, the mulligan system is incredibly generous in Lorcana, and that indeed makes it possible to do these things. I find it very interesting to hear, because as I mentioned, I had played a bit more limited, where that sort of thing doesn't really come up at all, and did not really have time to do really in-depth preparation or testing before the challenge. But yeah, if you have that time, then this is a really nice way to approach it that exploits the specifics of Lorcana, where you can have this high consistency of finding that exact curve and game plan, and then you can more realistically even approach the matchup in theory. Just you might even start testing where you draw the perfect hand, the opponent as well.
Yeah, that's what I did. And that's what we did. We stacked. So I did that in person. I stacked the deck. So I stacked 1-drop replacement level, 2-drop Cusco, 3-drop mini, 4-drop mini. And then, so then we would shuffle the rest of the deck. So you have 4 cards there. The rest of the cards are random that you draw into your hand that are going to be inked. The rest of the cards on top of the deck are random. You take the second deck, you completely randomize it, and you figure out how many games in which that deck on the draw can actually beat this opener. And you realize that it can't. It cannot do that. It needs a very specific set of cards. And you find the specific set of cards, and then you have to weigh up next time you're on the draw. Do I need to mulligan for this answer? Because I'm on the draw, because I'm a dog in this matchup, am I mulliganing to stop these specific openers? And it's just I don't know. It's just been a huge paradigm shift in Lorcana.
Because I think the biggest mistake people make in the mulligan is keeping middling cards instead of recognizing the exact lines that they could be maximizing their chances for, and like realizing how much more often these would be winning if they were to find them. And then if you put in the time to practice all these opening lines and realize how often do they win against which opening lines from which opposing decks, it will give you the information you need to really make an informed decision on what cards to keep and not to keep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this is a really good example of focused testing where you don't just, I don't know, shuffle up and play a game and then walk away. You're really trying to indeed get the insight on, okay, if things are stacked, should I mulligan for this specific card to stand a chance or not? And you can only get that by approaching it in this way. I find this an impressive approach that if I would do serious testing for an upcoming tournament, I would implement as well. And in that sense, Lorcana is a bit like chess.
Yeah, it's the mulligan is ridiculous because I feel like it's something like Magic. Obviously, depending on your deck, depending on the format, power level of the format, often, because we're talking about the London mulligan where you draw 7, you don't like it, you throw them back, you shuffle up, you draw 7, you put 1 on the bottom, which is a more powerful mulligan than Magic had even a few years ago. It feels like you have to keep like serviceable 7s. Like I have a decent hand. I'm going to keep this, unless you're doing something very degenerate and very specific. In Lorcana, It's not like that at all. Maybe if you're running a super high on inkable count, you're like, okay, I keep inkables. We did this in set 1 a bit. Okay, I keep inkables and I throw back my uninkables because like I have so many uninkables. But in this, I'm like, okay, my opponent is Ruby Sapphire. I'm looking for these specific cards. I'm looking for these specific cards and almost nothing else. Because like I just need to ask the question on turn 1 through 4. And I know like my deck is X% to find these cards. My opponent's deck is Y%, but Y% is infinitely smaller than X%. So I'm asking a very hard question to my opponent. And I think that's like the biggest level up we've had with Lorcana is just trying to abuse that mulligan and abuse these like micro strategies that you can play very specifically towards. All right, Frank, I have one last thing to ask you, and I know it's going to be a broad question, and we talked about it all throughout this podcast, but are there any skills that come to mind from Magic that you've developed in your career playing Magic that transfer very well to Lorcana, something you could distill down into, a sentence or a point that you could give to players that are listening to this that maybe haven't realized those things?
One thing that comes to mind is playing to your opponent's outs.
Mm-hmm.
When you are very far behind, you have to play to your outs. When you are very far ahead, conversely, you have to play to your opponent's outs. Just imagine the worst that can happen and go from there.
Yeah. Let me give an example of what it's like to play to your outs. I have one that comes to mind. So, set 3 Ruby Amethyst against Emerald Amethyst. Your opponent has the Ursula on board, the singular. You have no answer to it. They have multiple merfolk. You are far behind. You maybe have discarded a few cards. And playing out your hand, curving out just is not going to work. Maybe your opponent even has something like a crab on the board, and you have a castle. You have a castle. They have cards in hand. They could absolutely one-bang your castle. They could absolutely play the fox, bounce the crab back, kill your castle immediately. But you maybe take the line. It's like, okay, if they don't have that card, if they don't have any bounce effect, and I play the castle, and I start drawing off castles, it's my only way back in this game because I have to top deck an ink plus a be prepared to maybe clear the entire board. And that's kind of an idea. It's like you take a line that is okay, agnostic of context is suboptimal. Agnostic of context, there's a crab sitting on the board. It can be bounced. Your castle be cleared in one go. You lose card advantage, and your opponent gets all the tempo. You lose. But in context, it is simply your only way to win the game, and it's the only choice you can make in that scenario.
Yep. Or another very very easy scenario is you need to play Be Prepared next turn to be able to win the game. You don't even have it in your hand. But then you play as if you were going to draw it next turn. Maybe you drop the castle so that they have to challenge and they can't just quest with all of their characters. And maybe that's the best play if you are going to be prep. And you just have to identify, how do I win from here? Because often the plays that just seem good, they seem to make sense. They won't get you out of a losing position.
And an additional general piece of like magic-based concept that also works in Lorcana is that I think the better players, what sets them apart from the less experienced players, is that the better players always have a game plan running. They are not just making decisions based on, I don't know, whatever is available to them on that very turn. They always have some kind of idea on how the game is going to progress over time and how they are eventually getting to their victory condition. So, and this is something that really comes with experience in card games. But in Lorcana specifically, it then ties into, for example, should you be questing or should you be challenging? Should I even touch that location over there, or do I want to go for a 2-turn lore clock and I don't want to give that up? Thinking about, yeah, for example, do I want to be winning in 3 turns or 4 turns? Matters a lot in what you do in the current turn. Likewise, if you have, I don't know, a general plan on, okay, this game is gonna like do a lot of resource exchanges for a while, but I don't know, my game plan is that in, I don't know, 4 turns I'm going to put down the combo of let's say Lucky Dime and Tamatoa and win based on that. I will actually play both on the same turn and activate it or something. Having a general game plan like that you can work towards is something that you should always be striving for, because it then informs whatever you should do on the current turn.
I think that's great. I actually, there's a great example, I think, Frank, in your final game in Lille. I remember watching it on my flight back home, and you're in a very, very similar situation where I'm pretty sure the opponent put down like a castle, and you were really kind of trying to decide, did you want to kind of turn on the clock? It was just really fascinating because, like, I remember Spessy and Villain were casting it, and they were even pointing out it's clear that you knew, like, you're nearly 3 steps ahead of the opponent, or constantly thinking about, you know, your game plan is like, is this the way to get it? Comparing like your opponent's outs and stuff like that. Oh, maybe if they get to be prepared, you know, that's how they win the game. Do I just turn the clock on? Do I hit the castle? That type of stuff. It was really, really fascinating, and I think it's a great point. That it's if any of you guys want to try and understand that concept, I think watching the some of Frank's finals games will really help you understand that, because it was done really, really, really well. I also want to say the casters greatly appreciated you tapping the flute when you didn't sing a song, Frank. That was quite funny as well on stream.
Yeah, that was just a bit of showmanship for the stream.
Mm-hmm.
I do think I remember the game that you referred to. I also watched it back, where indeed there was a castle at some point, and game plans can also change as more information is added and the situation develops. Because I remember at first I was kind of in control mode for a turn, trying to like answer opposing locations and then win eventually after a while. But then on the next turn, my opponents played a whole bunch of things.
Yep.
And that changed. Indeed, the lore clock. That's an important concept. How many turns someone needs with questing to get to 20, and then all of a sudden it changed from, well, if I start to touch the castle now, maybe I prevent my opponent from drawing additional cards, but I'm going to lose the lore race. So it like from one turn to another, it can change from, oh, the castle is the most important thing on the board, to, okay, this card doesn't matter at all. I shouldn't even touch it, because if I do, I'm going to lose the game, and I actually need to start questing. I did write an article on that for TCG Player earlier this year, where I just provided 10 simple guidelines to improve your combat decisions in Lorcana. And some of the things that I described here are also elucidated with examples in that article.
Yeah, I'll be sure to link. Hopefully I can just find like an aggregate of all of your Lorcana articles. I'll be sure to link them in the description below. Frank, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and, you know, bearing with us for over 2 hours here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
I mentioned to you earlier, and I mean it when I say that, like, it's probably interesting for you to hear, but I think for a lot of us, like you have been sort of one of the key people in sort of developing and cataloging the foundational knowledge that is sort of what we understand about TCGs. Pretty much everything we extrapolate from is the foundations that yourself and other Magic players have set. And we pretty much owe all of our TCG knowledge to all of you, and we're big fans of yours. And yeah, I mean, we hope you just keep at it, to be honest, like, especially with the math articles. We love them. Like, we love them. Like that, you didn't even know, but we've been using that that initial hypergeometric math for the mulligan and the uninkable for over a year now, and it's foundational to our understanding of the game. So it's very, very helpful. But I do want to say thank you for coming on. I want to give you a chance to shout out where people can find you. I know you mentioned TCG Player in your articles, but anywhere else, feel free.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the kind words. I will try to keep more articles in that vein coming, though I'll also have to say that they can take quite a while to put together. So don't pin me down on it anytime soon. But I do genuinely enjoy running these sorts of analyses and sharing them, and I'm always happy when it also helps others. You can most easily find me on Twitter, or X nowadays, I guess. There I'm at Karsten_Frank. You can find my articles on TCG Player, and I've also written some for the Ultimate Guard blog. So shout outs to them. And yeah, apart from that, shout outs to everyone that helped me get there in Lille, from playtest partners to travel buddies. Going to these challenges is not just for like playing the competitive matches, but also for gathering with everyone and having an awesome time together. And the Lorcana community has been amazing so far. So, well, thank you to everyone for all the support.
Awesome. Well, if you enjoy this podcast, the number one thing you can do is leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. There's a video version of this on YouTube at youtube.com/@Podcana podcast. Hit subscribe while you're there. We got tons of videos, the weekly podcast, plus additional videos. Guess the card or guess the power level with Kawa and other content creators from other games. We've got tier lists, deck text, deck guides, all that good stuff. Twitter's at BrendanAPG, at Kawatech_CG, at Karsten_Frank, and at Moyen_HS. Thank y'all so much for listening. Don't forget to play only 60 cards in your deck, and we'll see you next week.